Well, good morning, students. I hope you're doing well, wherever your now finds you. This morning, I want to talk to you a little bit about several different things. First, I want to talk to you about the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. Now, these terms indicate the logical strength of the connections between the premises and the conclusion, the degree to which the premises, if true, provide evidence for the truth of the conclusion. Now, an inductive argument considers probabilities, and its strength is a matter of degree. In an inductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is probably true. We say it might be true, or it might be more or less likely, right? It's improbable that the conclusion is false. So suppose I claim Jim has often mentioned Star Wars movies in all his logic classes up till now. So he'll probably mention them in class this semester as well. There's no claim here that Jim must mention Star Wars in his logic classes, or that he has to, or that it's necessary that he do so. Only that it's likely or probable that he will do so. Okay? This means that inductive arguments have degrees of strength. Some of them will be better than others, because there's more evidence. And there's a lot of evidence to make it highly probable that I'll mention Star Wars in my logic classes. In a deductive argument, the relationship between premises and conclusion is absolute. It's 0 or 1. The light is on or the light is off. Right? In a successful deductive argument, if the premises are true, then it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. For example, I could argue all Eckerd students are human beings. All human beings are rational animals. So, all Eckerd students are rational animals. Irrational animals, you. I'm certain of it. Now, if these premises are correct, then Eckerd students have to be rational animals. Right? If you accept the premises, it's impossible to deduce any other conclusion. In contrast, an inductive argument can only be judged based on the amount and kinds of evidence we have available to support it. When we analyze inductive arguments, we want to find the degree to which the evidence supports the conclusion. An argument could be somewhat likely, very likely, highly probable, not very probable, and so forth. So consider, we have different kinds of inferential claims, right? And we have an inferential claim and a deductive argument. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, and it's impossible for the conclusion to be false, assuming the premises are true. But if we consider an inferential claim and an inductive argument, the conclusion is probably true if the premises are true, and it's improbable or unlikely that the conclusion is false, assuming the premises are true. So, if we're trying to tell the difference between inductive and deductive arguments, there are certain keywords or phrases that we can consider. So if we're identifying deductive and inductive arguments, there are certain key words or phrases we can consider. In a deductive argument, it'll be necessarily true, certainly true, definitely true, but in an inductive one, it'll be probably true, likely true, unlikely to be true, plausible, and so forth. And we have varying, in an argument, the conclusion is necessarily true. Like I said, that means it's 0 and 1, on or off. It's either going to be true or false. But in an inductive argument, we talk about it being probably true. Right? So we have deductive arguments in mathematics, geometry, and in definitions, and certainly in logic, while inductive arguments involve analogical reasoning, legal reasoning, moral reason, statistical reason, and scientific reasoning. If we consider the exercises in your book I'll be asking you to do, we have an example. Well, what kind of argument is this? Most college freshmen have part-time jobs. Sue is a college freshman, thus Sue has a part-time job. Now this is inductive, right? If the premises are true, then it's probably true that Sue has a part-time job. However, the conclusion could be false, since we're told only that most, rather than all, college freshmen have part-time jobs. Now, in order to evaluate an argument, to see whether it's a good one or not, we have to be able to pick it out, identify it, and figure out what its premises and its conclusions are. Now, you'll note that most arguments we meet in everyday life don't come all neatly summed up, like premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion. I wish they did. I wish everybody took logic and was kind enough to do that for us, especially politicians, but they don't, right? So in logic, we learn to take these arguments in their naturally occurring state and analyze them into a standard form. The first step is to identify the premises and the conclusion. Remember that the premises and conclusions are statements expressing propositions. So each step of the argument must be a truth claim. It must be a separate proposition. So consider the following advice, which I advise all of you to follow. Okay? Practicing with your lightsaber is a good thing to do because it will help you defend yourself from attacks by the Sith. We've all had a lot of time during the pandemic, I hope, to practice our lightsaber techniques in our backyards or wherever we find ourselves to be. Okay? Now, what we want to pay attention to here is the word because. Right? Because. That's what's called a premise indicator. It indicates that we've keyed in to the reasons for doing the conclusion, right? So the premise is practicing, the conclusion is, practicing with your lightsaber is a good thing to do. Why? Because it will help you defend yourself from attacks by the Sith. And here we see the great Luke Skywalker practicing with his lightsaber on the Millennium Falcon. And we have one premise here and one conclusion. And the example also shows us that premises and conclusions can come in any order in language. In our example, before we put it into standard form, the conclusion is stated first, followed by the premises. So the premises or the conclusion can come anywhere in an argument. So look with me at this example. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. If we look at this, we first want to pick out the conclusion that Dr. King is arguing for. And what he's arguing for is that all segregation statutes are unjust. And so the first premise, any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Second, segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. Therefore, all segregation statutes are unjust. Right? Now, students often ask me, does it matter which order the premises are in? And no, you could put segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality as the first premise, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust as the second premise. The key thing is to have the premises and the conclusion separated out. So we have to be able to recognize arguments. Remember that arguments contain premises in support of a conclusion. For example, this example from your book, we should boycott that company. They've been found guilty of producing widgets that they know were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, right? The conclusion is we should boycott that company. And then the other statements are premises. And there are things called conclusion and premise indicators that can help us identify arguments, right? Since they have been found guilty of producing widgets that they knew were faulty and that caused numerous injuries, we should therefore boycott that company. Therefore is what we'd call a conclusion indicator, and the word since we could call a premise indicator. So we have these are all listed in your book. We have conclusion indicators such as therefore, consequently, it proves that, thus, in conclusion, we can infer that, and so on. Then we have words that indicate premises, that indicate to us we're trying to give reasons for the conclusion. Because, assuming that, as indicated by, since, as shown by, the fact that, given that, for the reason that, and so forth. So these things can help us identify arguments. So in general, you need to keep in mind that the conclusion is an assertion that the speaker wants the one hearing the argument to accept, and that the premises are the propositions offered as reasons for accepting that conclusion. And you identify it by the logic of it. You identify it by listening to the logos. Here's one of the exercises from your book that I'll be asking you to do, right? We have here, buy an Apple instead of a Windows computer, because Apple computers have more features for graphic artists, and you're a graphic artist. And here in the book, they want you to pull out the premises. There's a premise A and a premise B, and you have a conclusion. Now, in doing the homework, you can go ahead and put it into standard form instead of using the A and B like in the book. So where it has an A, you'd put a 1. Where it has a B, you'd put a 2. And where it has a conclusion, you can just put that slash. And we'll go ahead and put it into the standard form that I like to use in my classes. And here in exercise 1B, we see something that's not an argument. It's important to also be able to tell when you just don't have an argument. Here someone says you should buy an iPad instead of a notebook. You should also buy a Honda instead of a Toyota, and a Panasonic television instead of a Sony. And this is not an argument at all. And if you're talking with somebody and they told you that, you might say, well, why should I do that? And then if they gave you reasons, they'd have to give you premises to support that. So that's one good way to tell if a thing is not an argument, right? You're looking for the conclusion. And if they're saying this and that and this, you could ask why this or that or this, and why that should be would be the conclusion. And if there's not an answer to that why question there, about the reasons for that thing, if no reasons are offered for what they're saying, then you don't have an argument at all. Another feature of arguments you meet in everyday life out there in the wild is they often come with parts missing. Arguments can be found in their natural state without a conclusion being stated, or with missing premises. Such arguments are called enthymemes. And this is generally because the person presenting the argument finds these points to be so obvious that there's no need to explicitly mention it. Suppose I just said to you, we're having just a conversation, all Jedi are Force-sensitive beings, so Luminari Unduli must be Force-sensitive too. Now obviously there's a missing premise, and I'm just thinking you know that, so I don't have to mention it. And what's missing is the premise that Luminari Unduli is a Jedi. So sometimes the premise is not stated because it just seems obvious. Someone said to you, for example, oh, you'll be fine, just follow your heart. The missing premise is all persons who follow their hearts will be persons who will be fine. Now, note that this explicit statement of the missing premise makes the argument maybe not sound so good after all. Does it really make sense that every person who follows their heart will do fine? And often that's why people don't say the premise, because if they go ahead and say the missing premise, it might make the argument not seem as correct. So, and sometimes if the missing proposition were present, the argument loses what we call rhetorical force. Someone might say, Mary does well because she pays attention in class. The missing premise would be, all people paying attention are people who do well. But again, you can see why the premise is suppressed. It doesn't seem true that people who pay attention all the time are also people who will do well in class. There are countless other factors that you'd have to take into account as well. And there are then more sinister reasons, often employed by those more interested in persuading people to their cause at all costs. And the proposition is suppressed in an effort to conceal the unsoundness or the invalidity of the argument. Sometimes people forget to put in a premise, though, or they believe it so widely accepted that they need not mention it. This can be harmless and even necessary sometimes, since it would become amazingly tedious to spell everything out all the time in everyday speech, okay? Just when you're sort of chatting. But occasionally, or when people are running for election, not just occasionally, they will be trying to fool you into assuming a premise that is questionable or controversial. So they simply would rather not mention it. Suppose I said to you that something is dangerous. Take your pick: smoking, drinking, taking drugs, parasailing, not wearing a mask when you go outside these days, whatever. And so the government should pass a law making it illegal. The hidden premise here is that the government should make any activity that is dangerous illegal. This is not a reason everyone would accept, because some people have different views of government and their roles in our private lives. This would then involve the need for another argument for this point, which the speaker might want to pass over in trying to persuade the audience of their point of view. Okay? For example, if you wanted to convince someone that they shouldn't wear a mask when they're going out, it probably wouldn't be enough just to say, well, the government says it's wrong. You'd want to give them some reasons for that, such as studies show that you can protect other people's lives in doing so, and you might show them some of the scientific evidence, and that would be different.